again to the Graduate Environmental Engineering Seminar Series at Michigan Tech. Just a couple of announcements before I introduce our speaker for today. We will not have a seminar next week due to it being spring break. Also reminder that if you wish to accrue the continuing education credits for participating in this seminar, please contact Dr. Eric Seagren. Next week, we will be hearing from some of our recent environmental engineering graduate students. We will be having 3 speakers who are going to be talking about their work as environmental engineers in different aspects of our discipline, including consulting engineering, research and government work, and work for industry. So look for an announcement about that seminar next week. But today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Joe Azzarello. And I learned about Joe in a very circuitous way. Some of you undoubtedly already know Joe well because he's very involved with Michigan Tech. But I found out about him through his wife's bio, and she is a pediatrician here locally. So being the graduate seminar series coordinator, I immediately got excited about the prospect of discovering a potential speaker, and I'm really looking forward to Joe's seminar. But just a little bit of background information on Joe Azzarello. He has been part of the U.S. Green Building Council and Green Building Movement since its beginning. He was actually one of the original founding members of the U.S. Green Building Council in 1993, and he served on its first board of directors as vice chairman of the organization, and was actively involved on the board of the U.S. Green Building Council during its formative years. And Joe actually helped pave the way for LEED, which is the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design rating system. Over the last 20 years, Joe has continued to lend his expertise, passion, and interest to the U.S. Green Building Council. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in mechanical engineering, and that is from Michigan Tech, and a Master of Science degree in environmental engineering. Professionally, he is a senior staff engineer focused on sustainability at Kohler Corporation. He directs Kohler's green building efforts and serves as a global consultant to customers developing green building projects. As a member of the Kohler environmental leadership team, he helps plan and direct sustainability efforts throughout the organization while integrating sustainability practices into daily business activities. Joe is also a lead AP and a registered and active U.S. Green Building Council faculty. He is licensed to instruct multiple U.S. Green Building Council workshops throughout the world and has led workshops throughout the United States, Mexico, South America, China, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vietnam. He truly enjoys teaching and sharing his experience with green buildings and the LEED rating system while bringing new professionals into the green building movement. And with that, Joe, we'll turn it over to you. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here, and I truly enjoy talking to especially Michigan Tech students about my activities in the sustainability arena over the past 20 or 30 years. So today we're going to talk about a bit about green buildings, past, present, and future, and some sustainability careers that may go along with the industry, and some things you may think about as opportunities for yourself and possibilities. So I've already been given a formal introduction. The only thing I might add is I am now retired from Kohler Company, and my wife and I now live up here, 10 miles from Michigan Tech. We have been here approximately a year and truly love it. And you can see I'm involved with U.S. Green Building Council. Well, I'm a well faculty. Well is a different green building rating system along with Living Building Challenge. I'm a member of a group for the U.S. Green Building Council that develops LEED standards for industrial buildings, and which can be very interesting. I'm a green building consultant for Yellowstone National Park, which I truly enjoy. And for fun, we raise bees. We have a bunch of beehives. I'm a home brewer. We're very active in the outdoor world here, and we enjoy it very much. So, what is this? I want you to just think about this and kind of question what this has to do with a possible future career. This is something that changed my career path. He is something, I should say. And we'll go into that a little bit and talk about what happened. So, building impacts. What do buildings have to do with the environment? Why should we worry about them? Well, if you look at this, buildings use 12% of the potable water. They emit 39% of the carbon dioxide emissions, are responsible during the construction and operation of 65% of the waste output, most of it which goes to landfill. And they consume about 71% of the energy needed in this country. So as far as electricity is concerned, you could see industry uses a fraction of what buildings do. So there's a big impact. And if we can lessen that impact or the consumption of energy in buildings, we can help slow down and hopefully one day end issues of climate change. So if you look at energy in general that's being consumed, everything from buildings to industry to transportation, buildings once again consume a bulk of the energy. And so, as every one of you know, if you have a issue you are trying to resolve or things you're trying to reduce, anything from a budget to activities to resources, human resources, you have to look at where most of your expenditures go. And right now, buildings are amongst the highest. That's where you might find most opportunity for reduction. Worldwide, buildings count for about 17% of fresh water withdrawals, 25% of the wood harvest, 33% of the carbon dioxide emissions, and 40% of the material and energy use. And in China, especially where they've had such a huge building boom, that's 45%. So what I'm trying to get across is we may not think about it very often, but buildings, the building you're sitting in right now, has a huge impact on the environment. Everyone has heard about climate change. I don't know how it would be possible not to hear about climate change. You know, with the hurricanes, there's fires, there's flood, there's drought all over the world, and people may sometimes disagree as to the cause of climate change. Almost no one disagrees that something is happening. So if there's something happening and is detrimental to this planet, perhaps it's something we should look at controlling what we can so we can lessen the impact of climate change. So back in 1993, there were three gentlemen who came up with an idea. David Godfrey, who was a building developer, Mike Italiano, who was a Washington, D.C. based environmental lawyer, and Rick Fedrizzi, who was involved in marketing and leadership in the Carrier Company. And they had an idea to form some kind of a group that could green up buildings. And by greening up buildings, we'll go into the definition later, but basically to have less of an impact on the environment. So they had the idea, and we created the U.S. Green Building Council. and LEED, which we'll talk about. Why was LEED created? Number one, to stop and reverse climate change, to increase the efficient use of resources, preserve nature and natural habitats, improve the quality of the buildings we live and work in, which is something that affects all of us along with human health concerns, and I added to save the world. Founding members of USGBC, a group of us got together. I was contacted by the three founders. I was working at Herman Miller at the time and asked if I would participate in the founding of US Green Building Council. And I brought the second paying company into the council, which took a little bit of talking and arm twisting on my end, but I managed to convince the Herman Miller, who makes office systems, office furniture, that it would be a good thing to do. So we had people from a very diverse backgrounds, from consulting engineers, the NRDC, Armstrong, which made flooring and ceiling tile, the Audubon Society, Carrier, real estate developers, and things such as that. We sat down to try to figure out what we could do to make buildings, the footprint of buildings, smaller. So what's a green building? No, it is not a grass-looking structure like I found in this photo, but a green building uses less energy, water, and natural resources, creates less waste, and is healthier for the people working or living inside compared to a standard or simply a building that just meets code. And a couple things to notice here. One thing that's become much more important is the sentence, the area where it says healthier for the people working or living inside. That's become a huge focus of green buildings, which we will get into a little later. And compared to a standard building, when you look at it from a green building perspective, a standard building is the lowest caliber construction you can have to get certified occupancy permit. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It doesn't mean it uses less energy. It simply means you did what you needed to do to get your occupancy permit. So for as far as a green building goes, we consider that the very baseline. So the US Green Building Council was founded. We founded this in 1993. And there's a website here, usgbc.org. You can actually go to and sign up, and you will get emails and information. And there is probably enough case studies and documentation and such that would probably keep you busy for a year reading all of it. And you don't have to be a member to join. You have to be a member if you want to vote and do some things, but as far as information, it's all free and all available, and I'd encourage you to do so. So LEED, what is LEED? LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. I don't know how the word environmental escaped from my slide, but it's supposed to be in there. And why did we name it this way? We didn't know what to call it. We didn't know, frankly, all what we were doing when we first started. But we knew that energy had the biggest impact on climate change of anything we could do. So we wanted to have energy in there first. And we wanted to have leadership because we were going to lead the way and show people how to build buildings that would have less impact on the environment. So the way LEED works, it's kind of like a cookbook, an 800-page cookbook, but it's a cookbook. And it kind of tells you what to do to make a building, the different categories of LEED, to make the building more environmentally sensitive, more environmentally friendly. And the more you do, and the more you meet the requirements in the LEED cookbook, the more points you get. So there's different levels, certified to platinum. Obviously, we didn't quite steal this from the Olympics, but I'm sure you get the message here that a certified building is not quite as good as a platinum building. Takes a lot more work, and you have to be much more careful to build and construct a LEED platinum building than a LEED certified building. Now, people have said in the past, oh, LEED buildings are too expensive. But if a building is built correctly, you can easily get a LEED gold building for no more cost than a standard building that is not even LEED certified. You just have to design it right from the beginning. You have to know what you're doing, design it right, and then you can earn one of these certification levels. So, as I said, we didn't necessarily know where this would take us, what we were doing, but we knew and we were all passionate about making a change. So we had a big dream that one day this would take off. But we didn't know how and didn't know what. So for a good many years, 10 years, we kept plugging away at it, wondering whether we were going to succeed or we were going to fail. And I'm pleased to report we succeeded, and they're still succeeding. So if you look at commercial LEED project, over 2.2 million square feet, or 204,300 square meters, are certified as a green building under LEED every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. A huge amount. In fact, the total amount certified to date is well over 3.4 billion square feet have been certified on a global basis, a huge amount of space. So more and more companies have recognized the value of building green buildings or certifying existing buildings and all the benefits that come from them. So it's a growing area. Every day, as I said, 2.2 million square feet. I'm not sure how many square feet Michigan Tech has in total, but easily in a couple days, I'm sure it's equal to every building on campus. So here's an example, and I realize you can't read this, but these are some of the categories in LEED. And you can see under the gray areas, the top one, location and transportation, and there's sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere, indoor environmental quality, there's materials, innovation and regional priority. All of these are broken down into different credits underneath LEED. And what the LEED cookbook says, we want you to do this. You can do it this way, this way, this way. Or if you come up with a new way of doing it, we'll probably accept that. So you just document what you've done and you actually do what you're saying you're going to do, and you can earn the points that we talked about. If you look at this on the lower left, energy and atmosphere, you'll see 33 points there. That is by far the largest number of points in any of the categories. Why is that? Go back to why we created the Michigan Valley Council LEED, and that's to fight climate change, and the best way to do that is energy control, energy consumption. So energy and atmosphere are the biggest points spread in that category. Now, that doesn't mean you can just focus on energy and atmosphere and blow off all the other categories, because each of those other categories has what's called prerequisites. And you must meet the prerequisites in every category. Once you've done that, you can pick and choose which credits in any of the categories you would like to pursue for your particular project. Now, I talked about the focus of the USGBC and LEED on energy. over the past 5 to 10 years, there's kind of been a shift in the green building rating system. And the consensus in the world was LEED was doing a pretty good job with the site, transportation, water, energy, and recycling. However, there wasn't enough focus placed upon the areas of material and products used in the building and their life cycle impact on the environment and human health and well-being. The consensus was more needed to be done to push material and product manufacturers to produce environmentally responsible products that have no negative impact on human health. Now, to stop here real quick, there are a lot of career opportunities in these two areas. Life cycle analysis is becoming huge in the industry. People are asking for this. To get a green building done, they ask you, and you can earn points to get your building certified certified through the platinum levels based on the use of materials which have life cycle analysis and completed. So there's a lot of demand out there for people that can run some of the life cycle analysis software. And human health and well-being. More needed to be done to push material and product manufacturers to build responsible products. People have to understand that about 80% of the environmental impact of a product is determined during the design of a product, whether that be a toothbrush to an automobile. So during the design process, if you're aware of how to green up or focus on materials that have less impact, use less energy and things such as that, you can bake the environmental savings right into the product design and come up with a product that is far superior compared to competitors as far as its effect on human health and well-being. So this is an area that is just exploding about how to do environmentally responsible design. So, 2 new green building rating systems were pushing USGBC along those issues. And I like to show this, that LEED is slowly evolving. Unfortunately, it's evolving. It's like most of us, and we spend perhaps too much time on the computer, but there are changes. These smaller green building rating systems were poking at LEED and the U.S. Green Building Council saying, hey, we're going to focus on some of these other areas, and they have become more and more successful. And actually, thanks to them, the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED have adopted many of their areas of expertise. So a couple areas we'll touch on real quick. U.S. Green Building Council and LEED, the Living Building Challenge, and WELL International Building Institute. So the Living Building Challenge, basically, instead of having categories like LEED did, they call them petals, like petals on a flower, for metaphor. I think partially they did that to avoid legal issues with the U.S. Green Building Council, but they have categories just as LEED does and just as WELL does. And their petals are place, which is somewhat talking about sustainable sites, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, and beauty. So they cover some of the things that LEED does, but they get into more detail on health and happiness, materials, and beauty and such. Now, beauty obviously is very subjective. Some things people call beautiful and is appealing to them, perhaps might not be so to another individual. And to be honest, in my 30 years in the industry, I have never had an architect admit that their facility was not beautiful, but it is part of this rating system and it is becoming more and more popular. One of the things that the Living Building Challenge has is what's called a red list. And these are what we call the 10 big nasty chemicals that you should not have in your building and in any products that are in your building when you build. So some of this sometimes can be quite a challenge. So these big 10 here, you look at some of them, obviously everyone knows lead and mercury are very toxic, but there's PVC, which is considered a carcinogen in Europe and things such as that. They say you can't have them in your building at all. Now, if you have to have a certain, you can get by with certain things, such as if you have a computer monitor and it's got very small amounts of something in there that's on this list, and no one else in the world makes one that doesn't have it in, you can submit that information and you can get a pass on it. But most of the time, they want you to follow this strictly. Now, there's the list of the big 10 nasties, and then there's also 777 different chemicals which are not desirable in your building. So if you have them, the building can still be built, but you just have to document it. And you have to make it available for the information available to occupants and such to say, this is in here. But you have to be careful with some of this stuff, because just because something is on this list doesn't necessarily mean it's toxic. It has to find a pathway into the human body. So what example I like to use is, I'm on the 8th story of the Dow building right now. This building has a lot of structural steel holding it up in the framework. Well, one of the things they put in structural steel is chromium, and that is on the list of chemicals they don't want you to have in a building. However, that also makes the steel stronger and a bit more flexible. So do you want it in a building? Do you want your building to be stronger and more flexible? And I think yes. And there aren't many of us that eat the structural material in the buildings. So the pathway into the human body in that structural steel, which is actually not exposed, it's usually covered in drywall, the possible pathway is very, very, very small. Another example is some of the clays toilets and urinals and bathtubs are made out of, the porcelain. That clay may have minute amounts of arsenic in it, which is toxic, obviously, but you're not going to ingest that. So we have to be careful, and we have to educate people that just because something may be on the list doesn't necessarily mean it's banned. Now, I wouldn't put in a residential area, I wouldn't put carpet in that may have chromium or arsenic or something in there. When you have young children crawling on it, that pathway into their bodies might be a little easier, but some things like structural steel, I think we're pretty safe. But this is a huge area of opportunity for people and what you're potentially studying. And there are a lot of employment opportunities in this. So the Living Building Challenge has created what's called a declare document. And in it, you're declaring what is in your products. And so that it becomes a part of the building documentation and people can look at it and see what's in there. This is similar to, you go to the supermarket and there is a nutrition label on pretty much, I think, every piece of food you can buy nowadays almost. You look at it, it tells you maybe the fat and the salt and all that kind of information. these are kind of like nutrition labels for building products. And you select the products that the nutrition is best when you go to the grocery store, unless, I don't know, sure, sometimes we'll all buy the candy bar, we'll all buy things like that. But generally speaking, if you want to eat healthy or feed your family healthy, you look at that. Well, the same thing with the Living Building Challenge, the Declare. And this is taking off and becoming extremely popular. Also, they developed a life cycle of the product. It's a product footprint. It does not discuss, the product footprint does not discuss, this is an EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, does not talk about the health effects. It's a life cycle assessment, and you go through a standard ISO procedure, and then you get issued what's called the EPD. And so let's say you were building, well, I'm from Kohler, so let's say you were building a porcelain sink, and I'd run an EPD on this, and then a competitor would do an EPD following the same ISO standard, and you could see it's the result to say, gee, the Kohler sink has less of an environmental impact than the competitor's sink. Therefore, I'm going to buy the Kohler sink. Now, what this does in industry is that competitor sees Kohler's EPD is better than theirs. People are buying Kohler sinks and not their sinks. So they're going to look at their manufacturing process and try to reduce the footprint so their EPD comes out better than Kohler's, and now people are buying theirs. So it creates a competitive environment where people are selecting the products which have the least impact, the least footprint. Now, people also, when they do this, once again, you go back to the green buildings, you can get more and more building points. So selecting these products helps your building get a higher score. Now, who does this work? It's the manufacturers. And so the Green Building Council does not develop EPDs or things like that. The manufacturers do this. So there's a lot of opportunity in industry for it. Industry, a lot of big industries have set up their own departments to do this, or they use consulting firms for people with these skills. So there's quite an opportunity here as well. So what does an EPD measure? Everything from the product life cycle, from when you have the idea to manufacturing operations, how much energy, the consumer use and everything. And once again, up to 80% of the product's impact come during the design stage. So people who are knowledgeable about this can participate in the design and come up with a good product right from the start. Because it is very expensive for industry to go back and re-engineer a product to make it green. It's much easier to do it right from the start. Here's a typical EPD for the Kohler. This is one of the toilets, and they vary in length and they give numbers, rating system numbers. But if you're working on a huge project and buying toilets, you can look at them from different competitors or whatever and make your selection, selecting the product that has the least impact. So there's opportunities not only with the people who do the design of the product to make it green, but also the people that do the selection and pull everything together for a new building or an existing building. So then there are material products used in construction. As I said, there's the nutrition, kind of a nutrition label. I forget what I pulled this off of. It's some food type and such. And there's a declare label, which is kind of like a nutrition label for building products. And then there was what's called like an HPD. These are the health benefits of a product or the health negatives of a product. And so people are using what's called environmental product declaration and health product declarations to select material. Now, consumers are becoming more and more aware of things like this. But the health product declaration goes into the details of all the chemicals that are in the product, whether they have a negative health effect, what they are. So people are using, as you see to the left, the LCA and the EPD to determine products. Currently, the biggest product label readers in the world are mothers. And yes, they look at the product that they're going to buy, whether it be anything from rice to meat to potato chips, and they read the nutrition label because they want to provide optimum and healthy food for their families. And so actually many of the women in a construction project are looking at some of the declare labels and saying, this one is better for my children and this one is better. And that continues all the way to the building I'm sitting in right now, a huge commercial building that HPDs, the health product declaration, and environmental product declarations are becoming very, very important. So we talked about LEED, we talked about Living Building Challenge. There's another one out there that's growing rapidly. It's called WELL. And WELL is a green building rating system that focuses on human health, entirely on human health. Does not measure water use, does not measure energy use or anything. It's basically on the environment that you and I live and work in. And they've developed their guideline or criteria, which is based on human health studies and medical studies and things such as that. And that is why most buildings that are WELL certified are also LEED certified. So LEED takes care of the energy and water use and things such as that. And WELL takes care of the spaces for people, the health of the people. So WELL provides a model for the design and construction to integrate human health features. Performance-based system to measure the impact of built environment on human health. Once again, WELL is like a nutrition label for your building, but it's strictly focused on human health, not necessarily energy consumption or things such as that. And this standard is growing tremendously as well. They have 7 different areas of focus, just like LEED had categories and Living Building Challenge had petals. They do air, water, nourishment, light, fitness, comfort, and mind. And there are options under each one of these. And they focus on these different body systems, I will call them, everything from cardiovascular to the urinary system. And they look at all of the human body parts and what is affected by the indoor of a building, and we develop guidelines for that. So once again, strictly health-based. People don't realize this, but we spend about 90% of our time indoors. You think about that. A human being was not designed to be indoors. We were designed to be outside. And over the last 200-300 years, we have quickly built artificial environments, things such as this building I'm in, the building you're in, and we control the light, we control the air, we control what's in the air, we control the type of light. And so they can have quite a negative impact or a positive impact on our bodies, because most people don't realize. And if you think about it, especially during this time of year, up here at Michigan Tech, people probably spend more time inside. than ever. So if you're inside 90% and you're inside of basically a cube, oftentimes they found that indoor pollution in a building is 2 to 3 times higher than what it is outside. So there's also proof that people function better in natural light. They function better when they can see green spaces or open spaces. So Well tries to address many of this in their guidelines. So I have a question for you to think about. Excuse me. What is the largest cost to operate a building over a 30-year period? What does people spend the most money on? Let's say I own this building here. What would be the largest cost for me to operate this building? Now, some people are going to say heating, cooling, HVAC systems. But the answer is personnel costs. So think about that. This is a cost breakdown, 30 years to operate a building. Green is the personnel cost, which is the salaries and benefits of the people. Design and construction is the little yellow sliver. And then maintenance is blue. Now, if you wanted to reduce your building costs on this, what would you focus on? Would you try to squeeze more money out of the design and construction, squeeze money out of the maintenance, or look at your large cost, which is a personnel cost? So what if you did something like a well building, like a LEED building, which caused people to be happier, healthier, less absenteeism, less mistakes, less employee turnover, and things such as that? You can actually, any money you spend for features in the well or living building challenge or LEED to make that building healthier will more than recoup themselves in the entire cost of the design and construction of that building. So what do you want to focus on? We want to focus on us. We want to keep us happy, healthy, smiling, productive, because everyone knows that everyone here has probably been in a building or a restaurant or someplace where they're sitting in a restaurant with friends and trying to have a nice lunch or dinner, and you've got cold air blowing on you or hot air blowing on you. How comfortable are you? You're not at all. So how much are you enjoying the experience? Probably not much. In my career, I used to manage lots of buildings and building campuses and things, and the comfort of people. Just think about this. What are you doing if you're sitting in an office and you're cold or hot? Well, you look at your person sitting next to you, your coworker, and saying, "Isn't it cold in here?" And that person says, "Yeah, it's cold." And then the other person says, "Yeah, it's cold in here." And you talk about to another person, "Yeah, it's cold. Management doesn't care for us. It's always cold in here," and such. And then they start carrying on about, the quality of the building, the quality of life. So how much work are they actually doing? They're doing none while they're complaining. If I'm traveling to 30 different countries or more in talking about green buildings and human health and such, one thing I have learned is that people, no matter where they are, they love to complain. And they will complain. And when they're complaining, they're not very productive. When they're complaining, they're not very happy. And if you're not very happy often enough, perhaps you're going to go somewhere else. So perhaps that company's going to lose a well-trained employee simply because they're not paying attention to human comfort. So think about that in the future. And where you might want to spend some time and focus on in order to have the most productive and healthy and happy workspace. 90% of employees admitted that their attitude about work is adversely affected by the quality of their workplace environment. And I gave the example of the restaurant or people in an office, but if you're hot or cold, you're not happy. If you're not happy, your attitude about work is going to go down. If your attitude is down, your output is down, and you're not a happy person. So addressing that makes the employee and the business owners happy. And a World Green Building Council did a study. Productivity improvements of 8 to 11% are not uncommon as a result of better air quality. Think about that. Focusing on the HVAC system could produce productivity improvements of 8 to 11%, which would more than pay for any extra equipment you put in there to make sure the employees are comfortable. And as I said before, EPA said in 2012, concentration of some pollutants indoors can be 2 to 5 times higher indoors compared to outdoors. So this is why people don't function well often in a building. The value proposition of LEED, improved environment, employees and clients, return on investment, and leadership, corporate communications, productivity. Think about recruitment. All of you who are going to be graduating soon and looking for employment, would you rather go to a company that focuses on not only the product or what the output is, but also on the health and well-being of the employee? I think all of us would like to go work in a building and for a company that cares about us as much as our product. Financial performance. Executives have estimated that they can have a 22% increase in companies' performance through their offices that are well designed. So think about this, 22% increase in performance over that 30-year life of the building. You've paid for the design and maintenance and construction of that building many, many times over. So as I said, working together, WELL often works with LEED, and they come up with a building that is much healthier and has, for the occupants and workers, but it also has less of an impact, less of a footprint on the environment overall. So there's a couple of organizations out there. International WELL Building Institute does the WELL guidelines, and the Green Builder Certification Institute actually does the certification process. The Green Building Certification is technically a sub-company of the Green Building Council, but they work seamlessly together so that they can certify a WELL building and a LEED building at the same time. So these are my predictions on the future of green building rating systems, having been in the field for so long. We are currently the 3 biggies, and there's about 17, 18 fairly larger size green building rating systems around the world, everything from BREEAM in Europe and the United Kingdom to Pearls in the Middle East to STAR in Singapore and such. But the 3 biggies, Living Building Challenge, LEED, and WELL, are kind of going to a universal green building rating system. And what this does is LEED now uses some parts of Living Building Challenge or WELL. WELL uses LEED or Living Building Challenge for the energy and water use. And they're started out somewhat as competitors, but now they're becoming more and more likely to partner. And so my projection is in the next 10 years, we're probably going to have more of a universal green building rating system. Energy and water efficient will continue to push the limits of technology. Buildings will become more energy and water efficient. Once again, a lot of opportunities here for people in the design area and such to work on energy, water efficiency, and things such as that. Renewable energy will become a standard part of the green building rating system. You already get points and such for using renewable energy, but I think soon it will become a requirement, and it's going to help push us toward renewable energy and away from fossil fuel energy. Once again, combating climate change. Building materials will have environmental footprints or EPDs if they are to be used in a green building. This will not be an option for a manufacturer. If you want to build a product to use in a building, you will eventually have an EPD. So there's a tremendous opportunities for people. This area is exploding, and something I'd encourage you to look into. Concerns for human health will lead the development of future green building guidelines. I think that the water and energy citing is focused on, but human health is a tremendous area to look into the growth of that, and tied in with medicine and such and human health. There's so many opportunities there, and the financial benefits are tremendous. Material health certificates will be required, and this is the health product declarations in a building. Once again, this will not be an option for manufacturers. You're going to play in the game. You're going to have this. So manufacturers are scrambling for people that can help them do this. Building occupants will become more productive, healthier, and happier compared to even today's green building occupants. Right now, LEED is on version 4.2. We started out in version 1.0. Every time we went to the next level, we raised the bar. They continue to do so because it became easier to do as more and more manufacturers came along, more and more products came out. So a green building that was certified as gold 10 years ago, 15 years ago, might not even make silver now because the bar has been raised. But that's the point, to raise the bar and to make things better. Concerns regarding investment in green buildings will diminish as more proof regarding productivity, employer retention, health benefits are developed. The CFO will become a green building advocate. Oftentimes, the financial people have pushed back on spending extra money on a building. They want, basically, I've heard the term, the lowest possible cost at all costs. But what they're realizing now is that if that lowest cost building causes employee turnover, less productivity, less health, things such as that, their investment is not going to be worth as much as someone that focused on the employees. Because once again, 90% of the cost of operating any building are the salaries. So back to the picture that I started off with. This is one of my yellow-naped Amazon parrots. And when I graduated from Michigan Tech, I went to work for the power company. And I was a mechanical engineer, and that was my life. You know, I was thinking about, you know, power and electrical distribution and things such as that. And I really didn't know anything about the environment. I knew about recycling a little bit, but that was about it. This is before the big green wave hit. But I had always wanted a parrot since I was a child. And I decided one day to get a parrot. And I got Otis. Otis has been with me 38 years now. If you look in the background, you see his partner Petra, who I've had about 30 years. But when I got Otis, I didn't really know how to take care of him. So I went to get some books about parrots. And believe it or not, people, this was before the internet. So you couldn't just type on a computer and get as much as you wanted. So I actually spent some time in the library and I was reading about it. And I was reading about the destruction of the Amazon and things such as that. And it caused me a change in my life and career. And I decided to focus on environmental issues. So I went back to my company, which was Herman Miller at the time, and I looked at what was happening there, and I decided there's a lot of positive changes we can make. And since no one was doing them, I took the risk and just started doing them myself. And eventually, I got more and more people interested and involved, to the point that in 5 years, Herman Miller was receiving an award in the White House for its actions. So the reason I show this to you is for a couple of reasons. This became a passion of mine. And you don't know where your passions will take you. I mean, you're all young and you're all going to be graduating. You think you know what you're going to do, but I suspect what you think you know you want to do, in 30 years, you'll step back and say, that's not quite what I did. So my life changed. I took a risk. I took a risk by kind of stepping out of the pure engineering stuff and going into environmental stuff because starting off mainly because of him. And I just want to encourage you all to don't be afraid to take a risk. Don't be afraid to do something different. Don't be afraid to push the boundaries. And one of the things that I found was that my education at Michigan Tech enabled me to pretty much do anything I wanted. I was able to understand environmental things. I was able to understand systems and science and things such as that. So I had a good grasp of what was going on. And because of my training and my efforts at Michigan Tech, I was able to grasp things in different areas that weren't quite what I was trained in. Now, I did go on and get a master's degree in environmental engineering, which benefited me a lot. But I didn't have that passion when I first graduated. And if I wouldn't have had the background at Michigan Tech, I probably couldn't have done this. And so my career the last 30 years is very different than what I thought it was going to be, because I pursued something different, because something, and in this case, my parent here, spiked the passion in me that I knew I wanted to pursue. So I would encourage all of you to keep your eyes open and find something you love to do, pursue it. And I have no doubt that with your background and what you're learning here, that you will probably be successful. And you may not realize where you'll end up, but I think you'll be happy for it. So I'd like to thank you for sitting through this. If anyone has any questions, I am available and I'd be happy to contact you or chat with you either by phone or email, and Professor Becker can put you in touch with me. But if anyone has any questions about anything right now, please ask me. Be happy to answer them if I can.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and also for your perspective on how your education at Michigan Tech prepared you to take advantage of opportunities and pursue your passions. I think that was excellent. We are just about at the hour, but if there are, one or two burning questions, we could try to answer them. And I'll just remind you that if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand or post a note in the chat and I will unmute you.
Sergio, you can go ahead.
Hi, Angela. Hi, Joe. Thank you for this great presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a quick question. I'm working in sustainability in Mexico, and so what's the most important challenge to incorporate these better practices or sustainable practices in developing countries, in this case, Mexico, for example, and where we may face larger pushback to incorporate additional costs?
You know, that is an excellent question. And there are some people that you may encounter that will never believe even the facts. I think over the last many years, the last 4, 5, 6 years in the US, it's been shown that you can have facts, but if people choose to ignore them, they're very difficult to deal with. So what I found is I keep trying to educate. I keep trying to explain. I keep trying to show the advantages. And in Mexico or any country of the world, if you can educate people, and I'm a huge fan of education and been involved in it in many years, that generally if people can be educated and understand, most of them can be won over to your way of thinking. But there has to be some benefits to them as well. If they're doing something and they've been doing it the same way for 30 years, and you're coming in and telling them, no, you have to do it differently, they should challenge you. Why? Why do I have to do this different? It's worked for 30 years. Why do you want me to do something different? And it could be quite a process to educate and explain to people and showing them the benefits. Some you may never win over. Some just are fixated on a belief, and it may not happen. But I have found that sitting down with people one-to-one or face-to-face and explaining things to them, generally most people will accept what you're saying. They may not always like it, but they'll realize that that is the most logical way to proceed. So it takes determination, takes patience, it takes you a bit of time to educate people. And that is why I give these seminars a lot, because I want people to learn. I hope you've learned something of it. And it's the same thing you're going to have to do in your career to help people understand the benefits and the reasons we should do things differently.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay, we have one more question from Armand. Very briefly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe, for the great presentation. Actually, my field of work is in structural engineering, but in my previous life before joining Michigan Tech, I was working in Green Building Council in Iran. And we actually have an adoption of the green, lead basically code in Iranian, environment. So we basically translate some of the points that we could have adopted from the lead into the code. And my question is somehow related to the question that Sergio asked. So the challenge, at least the challenge that we faced was the available data that, for example, for many of these materials, you need to have you need to know the source of those materials that you're using in your building, but these data are not available in developing countries. So and the other challenge was the incentives. So, for example, there are many incentives in the United States if a building wants to adopt a platinum or gold rating system, but in those developing countries, that incentives needs to be some sort of a monetary incentives. So what do you suggest for those as well? Thank you.
Well, let me tell you really briefly, that information is not often available even here in the US. And that is why this field is exploding of people developing this information. Oftentimes I'd ask someone, what is in your product? And they go, well, we buy this from so-and-so. We have no idea what's in there. And so it takes a bit of work to develop this database. But yes, incentives can be very helpful. In where I came from, lived in Wisconsin, if you built a energy efficient building, you actually got a rebate from the power company. So there are many ways to do this. A company or a government, if it wants to incentivize people, could say, okay, if you get a certified building, perhaps you get 1% off of your taxes or 1% back from what the cost of the building was. And if you built a platinum building, perhaps you get 10% or something like that. There are many different ways to incentivize people. And you talked about the challenges of getting this. Look at it this way. Look at the opportunities out there for you, for a business or for work, to help to develop this, and the database and such that Iran could use. It sounds like there's a huge opportunity out there. So yes, it's not easy, but maybe you'll become the leader in the field there and develop this data, and many commercial products will use what your information that you've developed and become better buildings for it.
Great. Thank you for those questions and the additional insight. This has just been a great presentation, Joe. And also I want to extend my welcome to Dr. Kathy Azzarello, who has been patiently sitting in and attending the seminar as well. So welcome again to both of you, and thank you for again, sharing your expertise and insight with the environmental engineering faculty and graduate students. I'll just add that if folks do have additional questions for Joe Azzarello, please do reach out to me and I can put you in touch with them. And we will reconvene on March 15th, and we'll be hearing from Ryan Kibler, Annika Kozinski, and Meredith LeBeau, some of our recent graduate students, to learn more about their experiences. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week.